Chapter 18, The Attic's Secret. As George gazed at the strange bewhiskered tree before her, she wondered if it could have anything to do with the witch tree symbol. "I'm sure it does," she concluded. George was rudely aroused from her reflection by a woman's shrill scream. Quickly, she turned in the direction from which it had come, but there was no one in sight. Could that have been Nancy or Bess? George asked herself, beginning to worry. She debated whether or not she should leave her post as guard and try to find out if anything had happened to her friends. Then it occurred to her that the scream might have been uttered by someone else as a ruse to get George away from the old house. "I'd better stay here," she decided, but continued to worry. 10 minutes went by. Restless, George began to examine the old tree for any further clues to the mystery. Nothing came to light. Again, George looked into the woods. What was happening to Nancy and Bess? As if in answer to her question, the two girls suddenly emerged from among the trees. Both seemed to be calm and unhurt. When they joined George, she asked if either of them had screamed. "No," Nancy replied. "It came from an Amish woman in the woods. As we were hurrying along, we suddenly saw her in the distance. She screamed and ran off as fast as she could." Bess took up the story. "We followed the woman but lost her. Nancy and I decided she was probably some farm girl picking berries or wildflowers, and that maybe some noise in the underbrush had startled her." "Did you discover anything?" George asked. "No," Nancy answered. "We couldn't find the man who was in the attic and decided to come back here to see if you were all right. Any more visitors?" George shook her head. Then, pointing, she said, "I want you to look at that old tree. If anything ever looked like a witch tree, it does." The other girls stared at the peculiarly shaped tree for several seconds and agreed. Nancy went over to inspect it, looking in the crotches of the low branches and in a few knotholes for clues. Finding none as far as she could reach, Nancy shinned up the tree and examined every limb. Finally, she descended, reporting that the old tree held nothing which would help them solve the mystery. "But the witch tree may be tied up with the witch tree symbol," she said. "If so, it could be a landmark for directions to the Schnitz. Before we leave here, I'm going to investigate the attic and see if there are any clues to the identity of the man who was up there, or to the witch tree symbol." The girls went back to the house. Again, Bess bent over so that Nancy might pull herself up through the trapdoor opening. "I wish I'd brought my flashlight from the car," Nancy said regretfully. "I have a tiny one in my pocket," George told her, taking it out and handing it to Nancy. "Thanks." Nimbly, the young detective hoisted herself through the opening. As she beamed the flashlight around the small attic, nothing was visible but festoons of cobwebs. Nancy began to brush the strands apart. After clearing a path toward the far end of the attic, she once more flashed the light around. For a moment, she thought there was nothing in it. Then her alert eyes picked out a dust-covered object shoved far back under the eaves. Once more breaking through cobwebs, she crawled over to it. Quickly brushing off a layer of dirt, Nancy discovered that the object was an old German Bible about 10 by 12 inches in size. Its once beautiful brown leather cover was now brittle and frayed. Before touching the book, Nancy played the flashlight around the rest of the attic to see if she could find anything else. But the Bible proved to be the only object in the old attic. Picking it up gingerly, she made her way to the trapdoor. "Bess, will you take this?" she requested. "And be careful of it." Getting on her knees, Nancy held on to the edge of the opening with one hand and reached down with the other to pass the Bible to Bess. Then Nancy lightly swung herself downward, holding the rim of the opening with her fingers, and jumped to the floor of the kitchen below. Bess had already laid the old book on the windowsill and was turning back the cover. The flyleaf was brown in spots and speckled from age. Nancy, noticing some faded writing in ink on it, shone her light on the page and read aloud. Given to Rachel Holt by her parents at the time of her marriage. The girls, touched by the sentiment and amazed by the fact that they had come upon the name of Holt, peered at the inscription for several seconds. Then a disturbing thought came to them. Was Roger Holt, the thief, a descendant of Rachel Holt and her parents, who no doubt were devout people? Finally, George voiced her thoughts aloud and added, "Do you suppose this house is still in the Holt family?" "I doubt it," Nancy answered. "If it were, I think the police would have looked here for Roger Holt." Bess suggested that he might have known the house was empty and used it as a hiding place. Then, giving a little shiver, she said, "But I certainly wouldn't want to hide in that dirty old attic." Nancy said she doubted that this was the real hiding place of Holt and his wife, since none of the stolen furniture was here. Also, she said, Roger Holt had both an automobile and a horse and carriage. He couldn't drive either of them in here. George and Bess agreed with Nancy's idea that the witch tree might be a lead to the real hiding place. She was going to continue her search for it. "Now?" Bess asked. "And what shall we do with this Bible? Put it back or take it with us?" Nancy said she felt that it would be all right for them to take it along. Sometime in the future, she would instigate a search for law-abiding members of the Holt family who might be interested in obtaining the old book. "If we leave it here, Roger Holt may take it," she said. "And right now I don't think he's the member of his family who should have it. I agree with Bess that he was the man in the attic. Maybe he was looking for the book and we interrupted his search." The cousins agreed. The Bible was carefully wrapped in some of the old newspapers and carried to the car. Nancy said she wanted to take the old book to the Glicks for safekeeping. "I'll ask them whether this abandoned house is part of a larger piece of property and who owns it now. I have a hunch that we may be narrowing our search for Roger Holt and Manda Kreutz." "Manda may even be back home," George remarked, thinking that by now the Amish girl might have found out that the Holts were not the kind of people for whom she wanted to work. "It's a possibility," Nancy said doubtfully, "though I think we would have heard of it if she had returned to her family. Anyway, let's stop at the Kreutz farm later and see." Bess was worried. "If she isn't there, I'd hate to have Papa Kreutz go into a rage and throw us out," she said. "I'd like to see him try it," George replied, setting her jaw firmly. Nancy laughed. "Maybe we can manage to see Mrs. Kreutz alone. I don't think she is angry with us, even though her husband is." By the time they got back to the Glick farm, Mrs. Glick had returned from the quilting party. After the girls had changed into clean clothes, they joined the woman in the kitchen. She was bustling about, preparing dinner. Sniffed George. "Something smells mighty good." Mrs. Glick smiled. "We're having old shoes and milk flitch." "I have no idea how old shoes got its name," said Mrs. Glick, "but I'm sure you'll like the dish. It's mashed potatoes inside of a dumpling. The milk flitch is pie. The contents are flour, cream, sugar, and cinnamon." "Rich," Bess murmured, "but yummy." Both these dishes proved to be so delicious that again the girls overate. During the meal, they told of their morning's experience and asked if Mrs. Glick could explain the strange-looking bewhiskered cherry tree they had seen. "Oh, yes," the woman replied. "The stuff growing on its branches is hex base. That means witch's broom. This information made the girls feel even more sure that at last they were pinpointing their search for Roger Holt. They told the Glicks of their plan to call on the Kreuzes to find out if Manda had returned yet. "I wish you luck," she said, "but don't expect too much. I'm sure if Manda had returned, the women at the quilting party would have known about it. And one of them confided to me that the Kreuzes definitely think you are responsible for Manda's vanishing." Despite this comment, Nancy and Bess started off for the Kreutz homestead. George had begged off because her ankle was bothering her. As the two girls reached the lane to the Kreutz farm, Bess began to have misgivings and suggested that Nancy drive on and not go in. "No, I'm going to find out about Manda," Nancy said with determination and drove up to the kitchen door. No one seemed to be around the barnyard. Nancy and Bess alighted and walked to the door. As they were about to knock, it was opened by Mrs. Kreutz. Grabbing each of them by a shoulder, she yanked them inside, crying, "Dummel Dick!" End of chapter 18.